So my name is Stuart Rice, and today I am joined by three amazing colleagues who will be presenting about formative assessment for reflective practice. This webinar series brought to you by the U.S. Embassy Rabat and ASU's Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College at Arizona State University. So without any further delay, I would love to introduce our panelists for today. First, we have Dr. Katie Ferrand, Assistant Professor at Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College, Dr. Carla Ferretto, Assistant Professor, Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College, and Dr. Carlin Ludlow, Senior Program Strategist and Clinical Assistant Professor, again at Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College. So good morning, and thank you all for being here. I'm just getting a little bit of feedback that my sound quality is not awesome, so I'm going to try and fix that. But while I do that, I'd like to invite each of our panelists to provide just a short introduction about themselves. So Katie, would you mind going first?
Of course. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm Katie Ferrand, and I work in the Division of Teacher Preparation at Arizona State University. So in my role, I work with students who are getting their licensure in early childhood and special education, and also with our doctoral students in the field. And my area of research focuses on the use of dramatic inquiry, which is active and dramatic approaches to learning to support students and teachers with improved outcomes in their classrooms.
Great, thank you so much, Katie. And just a quick check to see if the sound is a little bit better. Good, thank you so much. Sorry for that. So Dr. Carla Ferretto, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for including me as part of this panel. I'm very excited to talk with you about formative assessment today. I am an assistant professor in educational psychology, and my main area of teaching here in Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College is to teach introductory ed psych principles about learning and motivation to our teacher certification candidates, so our undergraduate students in the college, as well as some of our master's students as well. My main area of research has to do with incorporating small group discussions in the classroom to promote learning. And so I infuse a lot of what I do in my research with discussion into my teaching.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And finally, Dr. Carlin Ludlow.
Good morning, or actually, I guess afternoon, evening for some of you. I feel very honored to be here today. My role within the college is working with all of our lower division students, so meaning our 100 and 200 level students, when they first matriculate into college and trying to get them prepared to hopefully finish off successfully in their academic career at ASU. I also, as a senior program strategist, work with all of the undergraduate programs in developing curriculum and helping to ensure that our programs are as innovative as possible. So I teach and do some administrative work within the Teachers College undergraduate level.
Thank you so much. And again, thank you all for being here today for this very important topic around formative assessment for reflective practice. Before we jump into today's topic, I just want to set the stage for our participants. For those of you that have been on this webinar journey with us, you may remember that we started with the principles of universal design for learning, setting up the idea that we begin with an understanding of what our pedagogical, what our instructional goals are, and working backwards to build from that endpoint so that the course of the experience logically hangs together for the professor and for the students. And then from there, we've slowly been unpacking questions around plagiarism, around the ideas of how assessment can work to allow for students to express their understanding of the content in various ways, and also to allow the professor to receive ongoing feedback on how the students are beginning to understand the material, how they're beginning to master the material. And we've looked at that for both the face-to-face and the online context, and at large class sizes. So a kind of constant theme throughout this work is that we can do these aspects of really rich forms of assessment and have good and deep interaction with students, even if we're online and even if we're talking class sizes well above the 200 or 300 range. And so we're very excited to continue this conversation by bringing together our set of colleagues to talk about formative assessment for reflective practice. So as we begin today, our sort of first question for reflection for our panelists is really to describe some of the ways that you've used formative assessment in your own teaching and how you've adapted that to the virtual environment. And I'd like to invite Katie to kick us off with this question.
Thank you, Stuart. So this question is an interesting one for me because I've been teaching in a virtual environment now for 6 years. So the change to virtual learning wasn't new with the pandemic that came. So one of the things that was new to me, though, was the switch 6 years ago was kind of looking at how virtual learning is designed. So I noticed the courses that I had were initially designed predominantly with all summative assessments. So I was able to see what students were doing at the end of a topic or the end of the entire course, but not actively throughout. And so that was a big switch for me, was looking at how can I include formative assessment so I can monitor how students are learning each week and throughout the semester so that I can adapt my teaching to better meet my students' needs, but also to improve their understanding of the content and ideas that they were developing in the course. So I started small because I wanted to make sure I was able to provide them with low stakes ways to share information that wasn't also seen as busy work. So we started with some online discussions. So utilizing opportunities for students to provide each other with feedback on ideas they were getting about information, but as well as assignments and things they were creating. So that way I was able to see how students were interpreting the content based on how they were identifying it and what other students were saying, as well as connections they were making, new ideas that they got, and really found that to be beneficial. And so I started looking at, okay, how can we start adding additional ways? So I looked at kind of larger assignments, so usually ones at the end of a class that may provide their learning across time, and looking at how can we break these apart into smaller sections and get feedback from me that's really descriptive and allows me to provide them information to an encouragement about what they're learning in a low stakes way, but also again, providing students with feedback. And so we would break those assignments up throughout the semester to be able to provide feedback in a small group setting. So again, they're not providing it to everyone, but breaking up into collaborative teams so they start developing positive professional relationships with their peers, and found that the students were engaging with the content more when they broke it up and really able to self-identify their own learning over time as well. And then one additional way that I found that has been really helpful was really focusing on the students, their wellness outside of the class, so their personal goals as well as their course goals. So we start each week, we identify a specific personal goal that they have for themselves and a specific goal for the course. And that is them self-identifying an area they want to grow in. And that could be understanding content. It could be improving their organization, their writing skills, so that we're able to support each other. And again, doing that in sometimes large group, but also those small group peer groups that they're forming so that they can self-identify and check in with each other. And we do that every week. So we're able to track our own growth and ways that we want to learn. And I do that as well. So I share my own personal goals with them and course goals. And students are starting to say, and it's helping them balance even in the now, especially as they're moving to all their courses in the virtual environment, because they're really prioritizing time for themselves, but also balancing what they're interested in, how they're learning in their classes, to kind of take ownership for areas that may be weaknesses and developing the strategies to be successful. So those are a few of my ways. I know my other colleagues have some excellent ones too, but those are some initial ones that I have found have been really helpful, especially with the transition with everyone moving online currently.
Thank you so much, Katie. And I really appreciate you highlighting this idea of starting small, that we're not doing a wholesale changeover in one day. We're not trying to do it all right on day one. And I also really appreciate, and I would likely want to come back to, this idea of incorporating student goals and student sort of sought for outcomes in class. I'm wondering, Carlin, if you could sort of pick up on this thread and talk a little bit about your use of formative assessment, and maybe also weave in some of these aspects of how it looks for what we would call lower division or first and second year of undergraduate study courses and students.
Yes. So our students come into us really right out of high school. And one of the challenges and opportunities that we have as a team of faculty is to try to help them see the growth in their own learning so that they're able to understand that the college atmosphere in particular is more about them gaining knowledge than us imparting knowledge, that it's about their own academic trajectory and growth. And it's a mindset shift that we have to be prepared for as educators of teacher prep. One of the things that we do focus on is helping them see what their own learning looks like, and then helping them to understand what learning as a student is and what learning looks like as an educator. So we do a lot of formative assessments that have them take a step back from things in their own learning to say, if you were the teacher in this situation, what would be something that would help you see how much knowledge your class was gaining during this time? Or what would be a question that you would pose to the class if I stopped right now? And having them put themselves into a more active learning place than being very passive, which high school tends to be for a lot of our students. I will say that the formative assessment environment for me has changed pretty dramatically over this last year. I am not someone who had taught a lot online. So the shift to our Zoom-based synchronous environment and asynchronous environment has been more of a challenge for me to be able to adapt my curriculum. And I will say that the one area that I've had to be much more strategic about is formative assessments. When I'm in front of a class and I can read faces, I can see body language, I'm able to adapt the formative assessments that I select kind of on the fly. And I can't do that as much when I'm in a virtual environment. So I find that I have to plan in more formative assessment into my lessons. So I have to make sure that within every segment of 5-7 minutes that I'm doing something that helps them be reflective of what they're learning, think about how whatever they're learning contextualizes to the bigger picture. So it has been a shift, but I think it's been a positive shift in terms of my own growth also as an educator.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this idea that you brought up of intentionality, right? That we have to, in a sense, maybe Katie less so because she's been doing this so long. But the idea being that as we start out, we really need to be thoughtful and prepared, right, to regularly engage in that way through formative assessment. And I, again, sort of appreciate these ideas that starting small, intentionally focusing on doing it, particularly during a shift in environment, whether that be to digital or to different content or different class sizes. Thank you so much for that. And Carla, I'm wondering if you could close out this question with your thoughts on it, and even help us maybe take a step back and kind of give us your working definition of what formative assessment or evaluation means to you.
Certainly. I think of myself as I was listening to Katie and Carlin talking about how I fall into the middle of how my instruction has evolved over the past few years. So Katie talked about how her move online happened about 6 years ago, and Carlin's happened with the pandemic. And with my own teaching, the course that I primarily taught face-to-face for 10 years at multiple universities and multiple different sections, moved online in our college about 3 years ago. And so I used that as an opportunity to really think about my own teaching practices with intentionality. What was it that I was doing within the classroom that was the most central and core? And how could I refine that and build that into an online environment as best that I could? So one of the things that I always did in my teaching face-to-face was implement a lot of this active and interactive small grouping activities. And so finding ways to be able to incorporate those into online activities was something that was a challenge for me at first, but has become a fun challenge for me moving forward. So for an example of an activity that I used to do face-to-face that would allow me to formatively gauge how much knowledge students were coming to the class with at the beginning, I would have Post-it notes, and the students would have perhaps different questions on them. So these would be questions that you might find in a classroom that a teacher might ask. So they could be more test-like questions, like who was the main character of the book that we just read, or what was the plot line, or they could be procedural questions. Maybe they would be like, can you repeat that? Or what does somebody else have to add to that? Or they could be questions that were very authentic, like why do you think this happened? Or how do you think the story would go in the future? Something like that. And there would be maybe a dozen different Post-it notes with questions, and the students would have to sort them and talk about them in small groups with why they would sort them in different ways and how they would conceptually categorize them. And they would be able to bring their own prior knowledge and prior connections with past experiences. Maybe they would add another Post-it note for questions that they could add. And what I've been able to do is take that similar activity and build that into a Padlet, which is an online software where there's basically online digital Post-it notes that you can move around. And the students are able to do this in an online environment and then reflect on that within part of my class assignment. And so that was one of the things that I have found to be a very helpful way of being able to refine them. I'm able now to be able to take that, what the students' responses are, and get a sense of what knowledge they bring about questioning, and what knowledge they have to be able to measure, in a sense, where they are and be able to use that moving forward. I definitely I took notes here. The starting small is definitely something I would hammer home as something that I very strongly aligned with personally. And then I think you asked the second part about, defining formative assessment. And I really think about it on a continuum of informal to formal. So the version that I gave you was a very informal one, but there's also ways to do it more formally as well, in order to be able to gauge the knowledge that students are bringing to us.
Thank you so much. I think just a wonderful grounding in of these, all of these ideas as we launch into this next question. And Carla, I'd like maybe for you to start us off with this. Is how have you used formative assessment to help students reflect on their own learning? And I'd love it if you could bring in some of your own research and background on this when it comes to students vocalizing, right, their understanding of particular ideas and concepts.
Just to be clear, did you say Carla or Carlin?
So Carla, sorry about that.
Absolutely. So the ways that I use formative assessment in my class really bridge into with my small group discussions. So what we have found in my own research is that there are markers of discourse that we can use to be able to gauge what students learn and how strong of an understanding they have about a specific a piece of content. So we're not using necessarily what they're saying with regard to the content, but we're using the markers of discourse. So one of the things that we can do is use reasoning words and be able to think about, are they engaging in discourse in elaborations by responding in ways that actually allow them to talk about things and engage in a back and forth discourse. So are they arguing in a positive way? Are they giving elaborations and explaining why, using source information from the text? Are they using information from their prior knowledge? Are they building connections intertextually with prior course material from other classes or other readings? And
That's, I think, really interesting, because let me see if I can check my own understanding of what you just shared. So that in some sense, that what we're looking at is the how they're doing it, right? We're thinking about how are they utilizing a number of different strategies to make sense of the content, and how is the kind of content of what they're saying reflective of that. Is that close?
It is, yeah. So we're not actually looking at whether they're right or wrong. We're allowing the students to co-construct their understanding by being able to challenge each other. So if a student has a misunderstanding, not necessarily jumping in and saying, you're wrong, this is why, but being able to enable the other students to say, why do you think that? Or this isn't what I remember. This is, I remember it slightly differently, or I have a different experience that has an alternative understanding, and let's try to wrestle with these ideas together. So that is really where the value of the discussions come from, and that's really what we can use as we're listening to the students and listening to the discussion to be able to have that happen. And that actually doesn't have to be done face-to-face either. One of the things that I've done as I've moved online is be able to use Yellow Dig. And being able to use Yellow Dig, which is an online discussion tool, kind of like Padlet, that is a way of being able to have asynchronous discussions where the students are contributing and where I'm able to monitor them and understand, as a formative tool, what they're understanding, what their areas of challenge are, and how I can make sure that everybody comes to a rough understanding of the correct information by the time that we get to the end of the unit.
Thank you so much. And one of the things that I feel like this would really help students do is, again, developing habits of mind around how one has sort of productive conversations and does productive inquiry, right, throughout their throughout their undergraduate experience. And while I don't want to typecast you totally, Carlin, maybe you could talk to formative assessment and the development of the habits of mind aspect in the sort of beginnings of undergraduate study. And then afterwards, Katie, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that evolves over time as students move into what we would call their upper division or third and fourth year classes. So Carlin, maybe you could speak to formative assessments, the development of habits of mind, and in students just starting their academic career.
Yeah, thank you. And I appreciate you enunciating that, Carlin. Within our students, we have found that they come to us with some degree of trepidation about sharing their own learning with a class. They feel, because of different circumstances or events that have happened during high school or middle school, that they don't want to share their lack of knowledge or lack of understanding, and it becomes a source of vulnerability for them that they tend to hide. So we have to build up quite a bit of trust in an effort to allow them to be honest about what they don't do and don't know, and allow them to be able to question each other on pre-existing thoughts or knowledge that someone else may come to the class with. The courses in particular that I teach are focused on history of education and different intersectionality of sociocultural markers within education and their experiences. And there is a lot of prerequisite feelings we have about being a student. And you bring that to the classroom with you. And this shift that needs to happen in an effort to pull you from a place of being a student to a place of being a pre-service teacher to then a teacher is an important shift. And it's something that has to be purposely cultivated so that students see how they can change their ownership in their own learning and can realize, particularly through formative assessment, that these are low stakes items, that they tend to not be things that are graded. I do like what Carla said before, where she thinks of it as a continuum from informal to formal, that a lot of the formative assessments that I do in my classes are very informal. And it helps students feel that vulnerability and allows them to feel safe enough to say, I don't know this as well as I should. I do a lot of things, particularly at the beginning of their freshman year, where I would say things that would put them in a position to answer for someone else so that they don't have to give their own opinions. For example, if I would pose a question to the class, I could put them into a group of 3 and then come back to and say, I would like you to share out 2 things that your group of 3 discussed, so that it's not you saying, this is what I thought. It becomes much more of a safe environment for them to say, our group discussed these 2 points. And it allows students to feel this sense of non-judgment related to their responses. So some of the growth that happens within their trajectory of learning is personal as well as academic, because it is a shift in mindset. It is a shift in thinking about their own ownership, their own ability to grow, and the focus that should be on their own growth rather than an educator imposing that growth upon them.
So interesting. I love that last part. Sorry, I was just loving that idea of not imposing growth on them. I think that this is, there's a lot of themes that are being brought up that I want to tease out, but Katie, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you've seen this thinking evolve as students go on in their programs. And I'm wondering if you could also sort of bring in the idea of how this works with classes of different size, right? I think it's our conception of small group discussion might seem really easy when it's a group of 10, but if we're talking larger and larger groups, how do we facilitate that well?
And that's a great question, because in the spring, my class sizes tend to be smaller, where the fall, my class sizes tend to be large. So I have to design that activity differently. So one of the interesting things is I teach students usually starting their 3rd year, junior year. So they're finally taking classes in their major focus areas. So there's definitely that excitement for that. But we also have a diverse group of students who are coming back to school potentially after being away from it for a while, or joining us from another college or community college. So there's still difference in terms of their experience or how much they've had the opportunity to reflect it with others. So, and also in terms of making new friends, because it's a new group of students coming together. So one of the things in terms of, I'll focus on just the evolution of learning part before the group size, is just for me is modeling. So really modeling myself and how I reflect on my own learning and the content that we're discovering, that we're learning about as well. And really talking about times that I failed and didn't understand, and who I went to, and how and even with professors, when I was scared to go to them, when I was like, I don't understand this. And, and just kind of talking them through that happens to all of us. And another thing that I've found really helpful is I've asked students after they've taken my class to kind of do testimonials about that too. So whether it's creating an audio or a video where they share their own experiences and strategies that helped them with the learning process in different content areas, as well as strategies that didn't work. And they share that this process didn't help me, and so I needed to kind of self-evaluate and move on. And that way students can access those on their own. And they have found that to be really helpful in terms of someone they've been successful and they've taken the class, even if they had struggles, and kind of hearing from that. So that kind of opens the door for us to have those conversations. And I found that has really supported students too, and me sharing my own experiences of failure or questions that I have as we're still learning new things from each other too, and ideas that they bring to what I'm developing as well. And I found that to be helpful. And in terms of developing the class size, one of the things that we've kind of done is looking at how can we take away maybe not always meeting as a whole large group. And so kind of redesigning that in a virtual space. So taking weeks where we may not meet as a whole class, but just meeting in smaller groups in virtual online learning. So setting that up, and that's something that I do in consultation with other faculty that I know that they're taking. So we'll turn all of our classes that week into smaller groups. So that way students aren't necessarily, I feel like sometimes they're set to that time block that they have to go to class, but we work collaboratively. So students are going to all of their classes in small groups. So they're able to have those conversations. So we're changing our schedules, still letting them meet during their time blocks, but having them be in small group time blocks. So they're able to get the opportunity to have conversations with each other, but also with us, and using that as a model to support the synchronous learning. So it doesn't necessarily, and setting up times for them to meet together that may not always have us as well. So they can have that opportunities with some guided questions to support that peer interaction and learning together as well. And I know it can be difficult in the large classes, but the students have really said how it's helped them really get to know other students in the class that they may not have been able to in those really large class sizes. But it's also kind of taken the barrier away of asking questions when we're not always there all the time as well too. So really supporting them and just having them kind of take notes about their conversation that they share back with us. So again, like Carlin said, it's not I said this, but our group said this information, and kind of sharing those ideas together. So it takes some of those barriers away of maybe and vulnerability to allow them to continue that learning and grow together.
This is such an interesting theme, and it's one that we've heard in other webinars, which is this idea of vulnerability, of like allowing space for students and for professors, quite honestly, to be able to share what they don't know, to be able to share what they do know, and to be able to have these difficult conversations. One of the things that is this come up in the chat is this question of, can a teacher make formative evaluation a way to train them for the final evaluation? And I'm wondering, and Carlin, I'd love for you to kick us off with this one. If we say that the final evaluation, in some sense, is being a teacher, right? Like the final evaluation is not necessarily the last test in the class, right? But the overall arc of what they're trying to accomplish, right? Which is to become a teacher, right? Can you talk a little bit about the ways in which all of these methods, right, that we're talking about, vulnerability, asking questions, right, building all this, helps them become ready for the profession of teaching, if that makes sense, right? So how are these all small behaviors that are building up to make them a successful educator? Feel free to ask me a question if that one didn't make a lot of sense.
So please redirect me if I am not on the trajectory that you want. I do think that if we think about the end goal being preparing as qualified and as effective novice teachers as we can, that throughout their learning experience, one of the things that I think should be prioritized more is something that Katie alluded to before, which is this idea of normalizing failure. We don't go into any profession an expert. and being able to show students that improvement is progress, and that you're not expected to be fantastic at everything you do the first time. And that it's important to be able to identify when you have failure and what you plan to do about it. Some of the formative assessments, whether it's within the scope of a unit or a course, or even within this example of this summative assessment being an educator, that if you normalize the idea that it's about the growth, that you can have students sit back and say, this is where I came from, and this is what I'm doing now, and this is where I plan to go, that these are the process-oriented things I need to fix. This is the product-oriented things I need to fix. And have the students reflect on that, and you help them reflect on that. Like, what are they learning? Let's take, for example, the idea of facilitating a lesson, because we live in this very strange world as educators where we're also facilitating lessons while teaching how to facilitate lessons, that a lot of the modeling of what it is that we do helps them to internalize and apply for later practices. So if we're able to help them understand, when you're executing a lesson and when you're delivering a lesson, these are the key elements, but here's how to know when you need to redirect. And it's okay to stop and pause and redirect. And it's okay to reflect on, wow, I understood where I was going, the end point, but I had some missteps, areas of friction in between. So I think that in our trajectory of getting to high quality educators, part of our task is to help them see where those areas of friction are and help them be comfortable with it and know what to do when they have some sort of stumbling block. You will never walk, and I tell my students this all the time, you will never walk out of a lesson and be like, wow, that was awesome. You always walk out and say, wow, that was like that, they seemed engaged. Next time, this is what I would do better. And with any kind of formative assessment that I would want to give to students, I always ask myself two things. What is it that they're going to take away from it? How is it going to improve their learning? And how is it going to improve my teaching? If I can't understand both of those aspects to a formative assessment that I'm providing, then I probably need to reframe it, because it's either not providing them the information they need or me the information that they need, or that I need. So ideally, within this lens of being able to help students see their own learning, make modifications toward the end goal in a way that is lower stakes than it would be on a summative assessment. And in this example, being able to make these mistakes as pre-service teachers so that when you're in the field, you know how to correct them, because you will make them when you're in the field. But what do you do when that happens? I hope that answered that question.
As we would say in the United States, I think that was a grand slam response. And Carla, I'm wondering if there's anything that you want to add or amplify to that from your experience.
There's quite a lot. I agree with everything Katie and Carlin said. I think trust has a huge issue, and modeling. So as I'm teaching my students learning and motivation, I'm modeling everything I'm doing. I can't talk about how important active learning is, interactive learning is, constructive learning, and then lecture, the whole time. I can't give them readings and in an online version, I can't just give them 3 articles to read and 1 TED Talk or 1, lecture of me doing it. I have to be able to engage them in active activities in an online environment. And so that has been something that I have been, working on over the past few years as I have been moving in the transition online. And I feel like we've been able to be very successful. Just because we are online doesn't mean we have to be doing very boring activities or just, passive versions of learning. And when I think about the formative assessments that I'm doing them for two purposes. One is to be able to gauge their learning and what they know and how well they learn it. And the other is for what I can do about that next time. How can I make the activity better? How can I make their learning more effective? And so there's really the two purposes that I do for every assignment: the feedback that I give them that they can then use, and then the feedback that they give to me about what they know so that I can improve my own instruction moving forward. Because even though, as Carlin said, novice teachers come in and make mistakes and, aren't perfect the first time around. But as I keep pushing the envelope, I keep trying harder, I keep wanting to do more in my classes, there's always things that work and there's always things that don't work. And also being honest with my students. All right, this assignment wasn't exactly what I had in mind. Let's move forward, or this is what I learned from it. This is what I'd love to share with you about what I learned from this. And this is where, I plan to take this next year. Being open and honest and facilitating that trust with my students, I think helps them and it helps me.
Thank you so much for that. And then Katie, any thoughts to add to this particular strand of the conversation?
I think the part that Carlin was mentioning that's really important is really thinking about that end goal of being a teacher and reminding them about their coursework and how developing that knowledge and engaging with it and getting excited and failing really connects them to be really prepared to be a great teacher. And I think that's some of the things that I try to make time to stop and think about is, why do you want to be a teacher? Who are the people you're going to impact with your job? And thinking about how this content's going to really make a difference in the lives of their students, but also their fellow teachers and their communities that they serve and their families. So that gives them some context to think about each week. Why am I learning this? And really being able to kind of self-identify, this is going to help students by me being able to create a community in my classroom and an environment where we can learn together. So really starting to help them identify those connections too, I think helps them, for me, sometimes stop focusing on the letter grade. And so I think as students, they often are, that summative assessment is always in the back of their mind in terms of, what letter grade am I going to get? How am I going to be successful? And to start focusing, I think, more on the formative in terms of, am I understanding this? Am I able to apply the information that I'm learning? Am I able to engage with others about it? That's what's really, important, because that's what's going to make them a great teacher or whatever career that they're going to pursue. And I think for me, that's reminding them of that, because when they understand it, that's when they do well with their end goal with the letter grade too. They go hand in hand. And I think sometimes students don't realize that. So I think kind of connecting that back to be that the formative assessment is really important, as well as in their own being able to identify their progress. So that's kind of a thing that I try to help them remember too, that take that focus on the summative away a little bit as well.
Thank you all so much for introducing these concepts. And having been in the previous webinars myself, I can say that one of the consistent strands is this idea of, we have to be, as people developing habits of mind, as scholars, as teachers, is that we have to be open to the idea of productive failure. We have to be vulnerable enough to talk through ideas before we know we're right. And even if we know we're not right, especially like if we know we need help. And that this is true for any discipline. One of the interesting comments that Dr. Punya Mishra made in another conversation was that these ideas work for engineers, they work for teachers, they work for people who, they work for all these professions, because essentially we can't really get to lived habits of mind or professional excellence without risking failure, without risking vulnerability, and being open to the process of receiving feedback. So I really appreciate how you're all drawing out these strands. So the next planned question we had is this idea of formative assessment and higher order thinking. And I'm wondering, Carla, if you could start us off maybe by just defining this concept of higher order thinking, understanding what does it mean when we think about higher order thinking? How can we define that? And how can formative assessment work to gauge whether that process is happening?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think of higher order thinking as part of, again, another continuum or a level, right? So at the bottom, we have this declarative level thinking where students are able to just answer something that they know off the top of their head, respond to a test question in a way that they know the main character, they know the definition, they know the formula, they know an explicit answer in a way that's very clear and concrete. But higher order thinking is a way, or it's an understanding of the knowledge or the content or the material in a way where they're thinking critically about it. They're understanding it at a deeper level, and they're able to not only respond in a way that's one right answer, but they're able to respond in a way that pulls sources, that pulls information from multiple sources, and they can counter and think broadly about it at a much deeper level. And I do this, or I measure this through what they're responding, in the ways that they're responding, in the elaborations that they're giving, and in the ways that they are expressing themselves.
So Katie, I'm wondering, thank you so much for that, Carla. And I'm wondering, Katie, if you could pick up that thread and talk a little bit about how you've used formative assessment to really start to gauge that. I think it's very common to think of higher order thinking in summative assessments, right? It's the big paper, the big test. But how does it appear in formative assessment in your classes?
I think that higher order thinking for me is trying to connect it with application. So taking these big concepts that we're learning about and really trying to have discussions with each other about what next? How does this apply to my field? How is this information that I'm actually going to use again? And I think that's some of the takeaways that students read the article or watch the video and they're like, this is really interesting. And they're like, okay, I'm going to complete the assignment, but they don't think about how does this apply to what I'm learning? So those are the conversations that we've started having, is really kind of having them ask each other, how am I going to use this as an educator? How am I going to use this to support a fellow colleague or a parent to engage with a different context too? And really thinking about how this information applies to different people. And that's where I've started to see that higher order thinking connect. When my students start having conversations with each other about how are they going to talk about empathy with a child versus a parent and a fellow colleague. So they're able to transition with different audiences that they're going to engage with in their profession to really kind of make deeper meaning, and seeing that I need to talk about it or present it in different ways. So maybe being more creative in some genres to share that information through art or, dramatization, but being able to have a conversation about it potentially with an adult, but showing them the tools that they could use to share with their child. And I found that that's been really helpful for them when they think about it in different ways, because sometimes they're able to be a little bit more playful. So it isn't just written or spoken, that they can actually create something to show that too. And for me, that's higher order thinking, because they're really taking it to that next level that Carla was talking about. And I think that's super important for them to be able to do.
Thank you so much. And Carlin, I'm wondering if you could continue this thread. And I love, Katie, what you shared about things like empathy and these sort of less tangible sort of concepts. And Carlin, I'm wondering if you could make a connection between this question of higher order thinking and some of these soft skills or habits of mind that we've been talking about.
Yes, thank you. Oh, I'm so sorry. Sorry about that.
The dog agrees. It's a great question.
The dog is very excited about something. Okay, I apologize for that. The idea of us taking higher order thinking and being able to translate that into what our students are able to do within a classroom, I think is important, not only because they need to know what higher order thinking is, but they also need to be able to apply it. One of the things that I do within my classes to be able to help them, because we teach students about higher order thinking, we teach them about Bloom's taxonomy, we teach them about depth of knowledge and things that they need to know in order to plan and deliver lessons effectively. But in order for them to actually understand it and apply it, I like to take things a little further in posing a question to a class and saying, what would be a better way for me to ask this question about the content? And have them wrestle with, what would be, if I wanted to know how well you absorb this material, what would be a more effective question to get you to more critically think? So posing not just a question that I could get information about, but then allowing them to wrestle with the question itself so that they can see that questions based on what you ask and how you ask it allow great meaning and allow us to be able to focus on areas that just asking a question wouldn't get to. And so having them think about a question and then posing it to a peer or in a small group, and not only wrestling with the response, but the question itself allows them to get to a much higher level. We have instituted as part of some of our practices within our sophomore level courses, showing students a course objective and saying, I want you to think about how you could demonstrate for me that you know this. And instead of giving them a test or having a paper that is already scripted out for them, what they need to do, what the prompts are, saying, this is what the objective is. Now you go and find strategies, a method to be able to show with evidence that you know this. And it is one of the most challenging assignments that students do, but really meaningful. They really start to understand the connection between what a learning goal or learning objective would be and the evidence that's used to be able to demonstrate that. Those are things that really show that connection between higher order thinking and formative assessments.
Thank you so much, Katie and Carlin, for those reflections and really sort of pointing out, I think, that higher order, the way I'm sort of understanding it, which is interesting, is that higher order thinking and learning is learned, right? It's nourished, right? It's not something that people have or don't have. It's something that actually develops over time. And I'm wondering, Carla, if you could start connecting some of these dots for us around what's been shared in the ways in which we can form good questions, right? We can form good formative evaluations to start to, the word I want to use here is elicit, right? To draw forth students' higher order thinking, which I might also say is creativity, right? Novelty. So I'm wondering if you could start to connect those dots for us.
Yeah, I think there's 2 points that I want to convey that were coming to mind as I was listening to this. And the first is that there really is an importance of having shared ground rules or a shared norms and expectations. So when I think about when I do discussions in the classroom, and from what I know about the research on discussion, you just can't put a group of students together and say, talk, and have that actually elicit higher order thinking and have that actually elicit learning at more than just a surface level. In those cases, when you just group the students and say, go, those students may talk about what what they're doing after school, or, I did so bad on the test, and, those kinds of things. So in order to be able to structure discussions in a way that promote learning, or to structure your classroom in a way that really promotes higher order thinking, you have to have these ground rules and norms and expectations. Some of these are ones that we've already talked about: trust and vulnerability. You have to establish expectations that everybody in the group or everybody in the class has something valuable to bring, no matter what that is. And that will allow the students who are in the discussion or who are in your classroom to speak up whenever they have something that they want to share and contribute in a meaningful way. But some of this also doesn't come with just establishing these rules and expectations. You have to teach them a little bit. You have to give them the structure and the guidance. You have to tell them, in your discussions, I want to hear you explain your reasons, give reasons and evidence whenever you make a statement. Don't just say, I think it's X. Why do you think that? And prompting them when they're not giving that, being present in a way that you can prompt them and encourage them to engage when they're not. Teaching them the vocabulary, not even the vocabulary, but the terms. What types of questions should you be asking? That it's okay to challenge each other. These are things that actually promote higher order thinking, but students won't engage in on their own automatically.
I really appreciate that, because again, it suggests that there's some groundwork that we need to lay as educators, whether that's in a primary or secondary classroom context or in a higher ed context, that allows students to be successful in engaging in this way, right? I really appreciate, you can't just put a group of students together and say, talk or have higher order thinking. There is a structure that we need to provide to this, and I think it helps to remind us, going back to some themes around intentionality, right, around planning, that formative assessment maybe takes as much, maybe sometimes more time than summative assessment, right? Because it requires you to be more responsive in the moment. And I'm wondering, Carla, if you could pick up on that sort of responsiveness in the moment on the part of the professor, and how that plays out over the course of a semester, if that makes sense.
It does. So that's a very good question. I think that when we shift our mindset to be more student-centered and student-focused, it takes a lot more energy. You spend a lot more of your time looking at your audience, whether it's virtual or face-to-face, and seeing their reaction to each other, seeing their reaction to content, and being able to adapt what you're doing or adapt what's happening in the class at the moment is an important skill set for a teacher to learn. And it is hard to learn. We have a lot of our novice teachers that spend most of their time thinking about how their lesson went instead of thinking about how the students learned their lesson. One of the things that we ask our students after they give a presentation is, we'll say, okay, point out to me. Typically, let me back up for a second. Typically, after a student would do a little micro teach or a presentation in front of the class, I like to spend some time with a group or the individual one-on-one talking through the experience so that it's not just written feedback that they may or may not read, that they really can discuss through how it went. And one of the questions that I would ask them is, tell me who was engaged in what you were doing or what you were teaching, and how did you know they were? Now tell me who was disengaged and how do you know they were? And typically toward their first few times doing a micro teach, they might not be able to answer that question because they're not focused on the class. They're focused on what they're teaching. And you become a juggler of things where you're focused on your teaching and you're focused on your students, and trying to get students to see the class and to read the class is as important as focusing on what it is that you're teaching. It doesn't do you any good if you're teaching something that no one's learning. So having the students take a step back and start to reflect on what's going on with the class is really an important skill. And I do think a skill that translates into a lot of different areas of our lives, whether it's in meetings, whether it's in any other field, this idea that you need to be thinking about who it is that you're sharing the information with, and not always about what you think you're saying, how they're interpreting it, what context they're providing it, because ultimately that's what matters, is what they take away from it. It's not what we deliver to them.
So many great points. And I feel like we could continue to dig on this strand for quite some time, but I do want to get to the last prepared question we have, which is really about formative assessments in increasing equity and access. So I want to draw into this conversation before we start talking about some strands that have come up, both in this conversation and in the chat. So, so there's questions often in this conversation and others that we have from our participants that are around, how do we do differentiation, right? Can we provide different assessments based on different students' needs? Can we really provide, right, in a sense, personalized assessment or personalized opportunities for learning? And how do we invite learners of all levels of ability, right, into our class experience? These are all sort of themes that have come up in our various webinars, and I think we're also touching on in this conversation. And so I'm wondering, Katie, if you could start us off here with just your thoughts about this question. How can formative assessments play a role in equity and access?
And I think this question really touches on what I think all of us have talked about, is being student focused, that they're at the heart of all of the instruction and all of the assessment that we do. Because our end goal as instructors is that our students are learning, and they're getting this content, they understand it, and that they can apply it when they leave our classroom. So this isn't just a one and done experience, but this is something that they can really engage in. And so for me, I think, and Carlin mentioned this a little bit, it's about choice. So it's also helping our students identify their strengths, areas of growth. And so in terms of assessment, I also often provide multiple options. So that way they're able to identify, especially at the beginning, the way they feel most comfortable with sharing. I think because talking is not everyone's mode, their best mode, or writing. So, and like I said, being a little creative in how you share. There's different ways and comfort zones that people have. And for me, it's finding those out so we can provide those to build that, so they can start identifying and developing those other ways, because we are going to need to communicate through talking. We are going to need to do some formal writing, but starting to build our strengths and ability to share what we're learning isn't necessarily one way. So providing them multimodal tools and other ways to share is a really way that I found that provides more equity. And so that students are able to share in the way they're most comfortable with. And then starting to learn, okay, I may not always like to have a conversation, but I'm going to need to find a way to share in that mode and build on that as we go. And I think that allows that too. And for me, a lot of students, when they start self-identifying maybe areas of growth, we do more one-on-one and small group outside of the classroom, so that I can support them with those specific skills. So students that are like, I don't know how to write and share my ideas with my peers. So we meet every week to develop those skills. And I'm like, so that's taking that additional part to provide them that individualized support. And sometimes it's a small group that wants to meet, occasionally, to start building those skills too, and identifying other people, whether it's former students, other people within the college. And I think that's helping them provide that access, that learning doesn't have to happen just when they're in our classroom or in that virtual space, that we can create other times to support them in getting those tools that they need as well. And I think that's part that I found has been most helpful.
Thank you so much for starting us off. And then Carla, I'm wondering if you could, I'm getting good at pronouncing the end of your names, Carla and Carlin. I'm wondering if you could pick up some of the threads that Katie sort of shared with us and continue the conversation.
Absolutely. So building off of your, language of personalization and what Katie said regarding the options and the different ways of demonstrating their understanding. One of the ways that this can be done is within an assignment. In an assignment, and this also kind of gets back at Carlin's example with student learning outcomes. How can you demonstrate this? Allowing students multiple ways of being able to say, this is what my objective is for you for this assignment. This is what I want you to demonstrate. Here's 2 ways that I think you can do it. Pick one and be able to demonstrate that. But then also encouraging variety across the course. And I think this also gets at what Katie was saying. So, not every assignment should be an APA 3-page whatever, or not every formative assessment should be, a text box that's 1 paragraph, XYZ. Different ways of being able to demonstrate or express where your understanding is, either formatively or summatively, is important. But then also thinking about equity as well. One of the things that I think about is a very common tool is asking questions and having students answer. I'm trying to gauge where we are right now. I'm going to ask a question and then ask for volunteers. Well, we find that that is not equitable. There is a lot of research out there that calling on volunteers is a very inequitable measure. And so from a research standpoint, I think about that from a validity standpoint. My goal in this formative assessment is to be able to gauge what my students understand. So if I ask for volunteers, I'm going to get 3 people who know the answer or think they know the answer, who are not a representative sample of the class, and get that answer back. So finding ways that when we want to call for volunteers or when we want to sample our students by asking questions, maybe we do that randomly. We randomly call on a student, but there's also ways to be able to make sure students are prepared. So balancing those questions and ensuring that we're getting an equitable sample of the students, to be able to better gauge whether students have an understanding as part of a formative assessment is very critical.
Thank you so much for that. And then Carlin, I'm wondering if you can add on here with how this has worked for you, but also starting to touch on, as one of the newer faculty members to come into the online environment, how you've seen this as a challenge and opportunity in virtual class spaces.
How I've seen the role of equity and access, or how?
I think how using these different techniques for formative assessment and ensuring that there's the full diversity of voices is able to be drawn out in that virtual environment.
In my opinion, the virtual environment has it's been challenging for the diversity of access to high-speed internet and who has the capability to have their camera on because they have enough bandwidth and those kind of things. However, I do think that there has been some benefits to being able to hear from a lot of student voices. Carla's right, not just in her anecdotal, but also in her citing of research that talks, that says that when you pose a question to the class, you will get a few of those students who will share their responses because they are either confident in knowing, or that's their personality, is to be able to share, and they want to be part of that thinking while speaking. But the online atmosphere has equalized some of that. We don't see as many students rushing to be able to raise their hand to speak in front of a class, which means that at least I've had to do a lot more small group things, being able to have them share within a breakout room so that everyone has an opportunity to be able to share with their peers what their thoughts are, and then using that information in order to take that for some sense of growth for whatever it is that they're learning. One of the techniques that I think has been really effective this year in doing breakout rooms with students is being able to, within a group of 3 or 4, have one person whose job it is to extend conversations. They're not a contributor. All they're doing is asking and posing questions in order to get people to think deeper about a topic. So if I were to pose a question related to what was the impact on XYZ legislation for children today, one of the people's roles could be to sit there and probe and make sure that their colleagues within their small group are really diving into the question in a way that if you assign it, that extender person is safe to do it. They don't come across as bossy. They've been told this is their role. And that has worked effectively within my classroom when students are trying to get to know each other a little bit better, when they have less comfort level in being vulnerable and honest within those small groups. And I do think that it provides them with a model of what teachers should do too, which is to continue conversations and probe and allow students to dive into content more deeply.
Carla, I'm wondering if you could pick up on this thread of asking good questions and figuring out how, and sharing a bit in your thoughts about how this plays into how we open up equity and access for people. There's something there for me, particularly around inviting different voices into the space and different experiences. But I'm wondering if you can kind of draw out more of this strand for us.
Absolutely. So some of the research that I have been involved with was around the model of discussion. And there are several models of discussion, or multiple models that you can embrace or take on, but using the model of discussion called quality talk. And once I'm finished talking, I can enter the link to that in the chat. But using that as a foundation for how to support the type of talk that I think is the most effective at supporting critical analytic thinking and this higher order thinking around talk. And that particular approach is grounded in the use of, as we discussed already, or as I shared, the normative expectations and the ground rules that we set at the beginning of the discussion, but also the explicit instruction of how to ask good questions. So by coming up with, in the class and in the small group, a set of shared vocabulary that we use for authentic discussion, and also being very meta about it. So in a discussion, a student might say, I am going to ask my authentic question, and then they begin to ask an authentic question. But also they come to the discussion prepared with questions in advance. So not just, there is absolutely questions that emerge over the course of the discussion as a result of other discourse or other parts or responses that students engage in. But they start off, or they punt the discussion with true questions that they have and that they've generated about the content. But what's important about it is it's questions that they're genuinely interested in knowing the answer to, and it's ones that don't always have a right answer. Maybe they have two possible right answers, and they engage in debate. Is it X or is it Y? And so they then, as a group, co-construct their understanding. And as part of the explicit instruction I've already shared, the norm is that everybody has something of value to bring. And I think once the students begin to understand that their role is actually to challenge each other, just like Carlin said, everybody actually challenges each other and says, why do you think that? Or how do you know that? Or where did you come up with that answer? Or why do you think that that's the most appropriate answer? And when they begin to accept that their roles are to do that challenging and to do the elaboration, that allows them all to bring their own past experiences and their own prior knowledge to the discussion to help build a richer understanding, more than what we would think of happening otherwise.
Thank you so much. And I love this theme that's emerged of challenging, right? Of challenging each other, of challenging existing models of thinking. And Katie, I'm wondering if you could close out this strand just by, sharing some of your thoughts on this aspect of challenge, about how by challenging our students, challenging ourselves as professors, challenging the group collectively, the group of students and the professor collectively, creates a richer experience and deeper learning overall.
No, that's a great question. And I think, again, it goes back to me sharing examples of when I've been challenged too, as well, or even modeling that with other professors that they have has been a helpful way to do that in terms of sharing that information so they can see the discussion. And I think it goes back to what Carla was saying about those kind of ground rules, setting that as an expectation. So in terms of developing that positive conversation. So in my class, we're expecting that everyone's going to share or ask a question. So it's kind of like yes and. So similar to what you've been doing, Stuart, today, identifying whether it's a question you have based on what someone said or a different perspective, or building upon that. So that is the expectation that's set. And that, I think it goes to the heart of the questions we ask that we talked about as well, in terms of that they are open-ended. So we don't want it to be two people respond and the conversation's over. We don't want there to be an easy answer. I think so in terms of, I think the time that you spend to really design these questions, and like Carla said, having your students prepare them ahead of time. So they've been thoughtful about these questions, that they're really thinking about how is this gonna lead to a really rich discussion where people are gonna have different ideas. And I think also it's that expectation that we want you to bring your lived experiences. We want you to bring your personal connections and even new ideas that you didn't think of that you got from someone else, and how that maybe has changed or slightly made you think about something differently that you've previously said. So I think those are it's very thoughtful. And I think those are the parts about formative assessments and even conversations that it does take a lot more work, I think, than writing a summative final assignment that we know the specific outcomes that we want them to hit. But this is really thinking is we really want to see how they're engaging with each other with this learning, and that they're helping us learn new ideas too. And I think that's something that's important to share, that I often am like, I've never even considered that as an idea. And, so being able to share that a lot of these concepts are higher order, and that they're continually to develop new ways of thinking about it. So, but we wouldn't get that if there wasn't often sometimes tension, in terms of ideas, backgrounds, experiences, and that's what this is all about. And I think that's the amazing part of college, is you get to interact with people who've had different experiences and different backgrounds, and to hear ideas and perspectives that really continue to help you grow as a person, but also within your profession, to think about the people that you will interact with too when you graduate.
I have one or two more things to build off of that, Katie. I loved your answer. Everything, I definitely underscore that, but also realizing that when we have this shift from what used to be a very passive lecture-based course and into a class that really values discussion, this is often countering a decade or more of what students are familiar with. And so even with embracing discussion and embracing active techniques and small group activities in the classroom, it doesn't happen right away. It requires support, it requires guidance, it requires encouragement, it requires modeling and explaining why this is of value, it reminding students that everybody brings unique experiences and unique contributions to the discussion of value, and it will happen over time. But it requires this regular practice and engagement and reminding over time for this effective discussion and for these rich discussions. And students are also afraid to challenge. It is very, very difficult to promote a safe space in which students truly feel comfortable being just avid challengers. Now, some students will challenge without too much of a difficulty, but you will certainly want to encourage this and allow this opportunity for students to be able to recognize the value that challenging has and disagreement has in resolving misconceptions, in filling in gaps in knowledge, and being able to allow students to be able to generate the stronger understanding that they can do and that they can construct as a group.
I thank you, Katie, and thank you, Carla, so much for that. I thought to myself, no one has ever said that I'm uncomfortable challenging, or even arguing for that matter. We've covered so much amazing ground, and I'd like to thank the three of you for this really amazing conversation. We have a couple of questions that have been coming up that I think we can sort of answer in a kind of almost a speed round of things. But so what I'd like to do, Carlin, is have you sort of think about how can professors, how can teachers build their toolkit of formative assessment tools, right? Where does one go to find good forms of formative assessment, as it were?
That's a great question. I think that visiting colleagues' classrooms and watching them teach is probably the most valuable, because you're able to see the level at which the learners are and how a colleague interacts with them and what techniques they use, knowing that the students are likely on the same developmental level as your students are. Being able to visit their virtual classrooms, being able to visit their real classrooms are important. The other place I would encourage people to look is at kindergarten teachers. Kindergarten teachers are so good at being able to keep students on task, but ask really good questions. Kindergartners have very short attention spans. And so it's important to be able to build in formative assessments and activities. And sometimes when I feel like I'm stuck on a lesson and I'm like, you know what, it's just not as engaging as I want it to be, I think about what would a primary school teacher do to help engage it. And then it may not be something as silly as making up a song, but it could be, or else it could be something where the students are doing something interactive. That thinking about college level teaching does not mean we have to take the fun out of it and have to take the engagement piece out of it. But I would encourage us to think about how do we engage young children, because I will tell you, I think that college age probably have not much more attention spans than kindergartners do, that we, especially with, you know, their ability to check Snapchat all day, that we need to keep them as engaged as possible within our class. And that's our job, is to be able to help them continue to learn.
I can affirm the shortness of attention spans of adults from personal experience of my own self. So thank you so much, Carlin. Carla, I'm wondering, one of the common questions we often have in these webinars has to do with academic integrity. And I'm wondering if you could share some thoughts on how formative assessment actually bolsters the process of academic integrity because a student is sharing their thinking all along?
That's I'm so happy that you asked that question, because one of the things that I wanted to talk about as part of my thinking regarding formative assessment is really the focus on mastery. And so when we think about mastery learning or learning towards mastery, the goal is to improve and the goal is to learn and to understand. And so really that's what formative assessment is about. When I'm doing a formative assessment, I want to measure what students know and understand. And there really aren't wrong answers. If there are wrong answers, for me, that means that I should then use that, or I can use that either this time to repair a misunderstanding or correct a misunderstanding, or next time. Maybe the example that I gave wasn't an appropriate example. Maybe the example actually facilitated a misconception that I didn't intend, or a misunderstanding, or it wasn't as applicable as I thought it was. And so when the goal is mastery, there's no reason to cheat. Like, for a student to take one of my pre-activities, which is designed as a formative assessment, and to cheat on that doesn't help them. It doesn't help me. Maybe they get the submission done, or maybe they turn it in, or they're present, but they know it doesn't help them. So there's less of an incentive for issues of academic integrity, because the main emphasis and the main goal is for them to improve their learning. And one of the reasons why I love teaching here is that my students are future teachers. They want to learn. They want to understand this. They want to master this. They understand what the purpose is. And that also may be something else I should express, that when we do these things and when we're teaching, we teach for a reason. So we do need to be very, very clear about why we're learning this. This is why we're learning this theory of motivation, because I want you to be able to utilize these concepts in your class moving forward. And all of my students want to be able to motivate their students. And so for them, there's less incentive to cheat, because they want to understand the information. They want to learn it. They want to get feedback on how well they've learned it. And that is a positive cycle towards learning and understanding and mastery, and then hopefully eventually application and being able to implement them in their own classrooms.
Thank you so much. And then with just about a minute left, Katie, if you wouldn't mind just closing us out with the top 3 things you've learned about motivating and engaging students in online environments.
And I think motivating and engaging students online, I think going back to where we started, starting small. So getting those ideas and hooks to get them excited about what you're doing is definitely one of those things. I think sometimes we overthink and we try to overplan all of these really engaging activities instead of just really focusing on what do the students want? What have they said they like, they need, and what have we noticed from that? And I think starting small is a great way to do that in terms of engagement and motivation. And 2, modeling. I think if we come in excited to teach and excited to see them and really make those genuine connections to get to know our students, they're motivated, they're engaged. And I think that's a huge part of it, is how we feel about teaching. And I think you can see that between us today, we're passionate about it. We love the opportunities we get to be with our students. And that time is my sacred time in the week, whether it's my actual course time, my office hours, my one-on-ones with them, that's my favorite time of the week. And so letting them know that. And I think what I believe Carlin touched upon is kind of thinking about the end goal. What do they want to be when they leave the classroom? So that way they have that purpose, that drive to engage in conversation, to create something creative about what they're learning, or to ask that question, or maybe take a risk about something they're unsure about, so that they know that's all contributing to them becoming the best educator that they can be. And that's truly the end goal of their college experience, whatever the profession is for them. So those would be my 3 takeaways for motivation.
Thank you so much for a very full conversation, for a wonderful way to start the morning here in the United States on Arizona time, or to end the day for many people in Morocco. or wherever else you're coming from in the world. So on behalf of Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College and the U.S. Embassy in Rabat, thank you so much to our presenters today. Thank you, Katie, Carla, and Carlin, for sharing your wisdom and time with us. Thank you to all of our participants for your engagement today. As a reminder, we will be sending out a digital certificate following this webinar in the next 2 to 3 weeks. And for those who have attended 4 or more of these sessions, we are offering a digital badge. We'd also like you, as you leave the webinar, to begin reflecting on what new idea you might want to apply from what you've learned today. And be prepared to share that with us in April at our last webinar. So again, on behalf of Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College and the U.S. Embassy, thank you to our presenters, thank you to our participants, and have a wonderful rest of your day or evening. Thank you all.